Hey everyone, welcome to episode 21 of Food Culture Curious. Today's episode is actually a crossover episode. It was originally published by Integrative IDEAs and Dietetics podcast, which I definitely recommend that you check out. They are also working to be more culturally inclusive in nutrition recommendations. And my episode in particular talks about things that I have not yet discussed on this podcast, such as my road to becoming a dietitian and a lot of barriers that I had to overcome. I do open up about financial barriers, mental health, difficulties about being first gen, and I also talk about my career path that took me to where I am today, including when I was a dietitian at a maximum security prison. So I hope you enjoy learning about that. Of course, I do talk about how to make the kidney diet more culturally inclusive for the Hispanic population. You guys know that's something that's near and dear to my heart. So I hope you enjoy this episode.
Areli is a registered and licensed dietitian who has worked in nutrition and wellness in retail, government, clinical inpatient, and outpatient settings. Areli received her Bachelor's of Science in Nutritional Science from Texas A&M University and her Master's of Science in Nutrition from Texas Women's University. She completed her dietetic internship at Michael E. DeBacke VA Medical Center in Houston. Currently, she works as a renal dietitian for DaVita Kidney Care, where she has held many additional champion roles. Areli is committed to improving cultural competency as well as practicing with cultural humility and discusses this topic with other healthcare professionals on her own podcast, Food Culture Curious, which is well worth a listen. She additionally presented at the 2023 FNCE, the Food and Nutrition Conference and Expo, on cultural inclusivity in the renal diet for Latinos, the very topic that we'll dive into today. Areli has a passion for giving back to her profession, having previously served on the Texas Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics as communication coordinator, a director-elect and director, and is currently serving as nomination chair-elect for Latinos and Hispanics in Nutrition and Dietetics, which is, of course, a practice group within the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. In her free time, she loves Latin dancing, cozy mystery novels, playing with her Labradors, and spending time with friends and family. Lovely, lovely bio. Welcome, Areli. Thanks so much for taking time to be here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this should be really a lot of fun. So I saw that you had presented in 2023, just a few months back at this point. And the title of your session was Beans on the Scene: Adding Latino Foods to the Renal Patient's Diet. And so I thought, gosh, what a perfect person, to come on and talk with us a little bit about culturally competent or sensitive care in the population that you work with, in the renal population, but also would love to hear about your journey to this point. So let's go ahead and start with that. Describe for us a little bit about the journey that you've taken to become the RDN that you are today, some of the influences that have shaped your thinking, and some of the stops along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sarah, it's actually very challenging to talk about my journey without having to go a little bit into the difficulties of being first gen. And this is something that I like to talk about, especially with other Latino and Latina students that are struggling to become dietitians, because I think a lot of people are not aware of just how many financial burdens we have to deal with, the language burden. Like, for example, my parents to this day, they still don't, speak English. So trying to navigate FAFSA and scholarships and everything on your own is just such a big challenge. I was aware, early on that we were not going to be in the financial situation for them to pay for me to go to college. So I had to work my butt off in high school, try to get as many scholarships as I could. And even then, I still had to hold multiple part-time jobs in order to finish my bachelor's. And when you're spending so much time working, you don't have the same time to study as other people. So that ended up affecting my GPA, which made getting into internships a lot harder. And then on top of that, your choices are narrowed even more because you can really only pick an internship that's either free or paid or has a stipend, sorry. And those are very few and far between and very competitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my first choice was the VA in Houston. I applied to that as I was graduating, did not get in.
Mm-hmm.
So I went home, started working for WIC as a nutritionist.
Mm-hmm.
And back home for me is the Rio Grande Valley. So that's the cities that border Texas and Mexico, right? So I had a very big Hispanic population that I was working with.
Mm-hmm.
Getting to use those counseling skills was awesome. And I was saving up money thinking, okay, like eventually I'm going to have to move to the city or to Houston to do my internship. So applied again, did not get in. So then I started on my master's thinking, okay, well, I have to consider either finishing my master's first, and I was taking, a couple of classes at a time, working like still full time and going to school.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, okay, I'm either going to have to do my master's first and then get an internship, or maybe I can do the WIC internship, but for that one, you have to work there at least 2 years. So I was just trying to explore all my options. So I applied again, still didn't get in. But at this point, to wrap up my degree, I moved to Houston to take the classes that were in person.
Mm.
And I also started working part-time at Jenny Craig, which, we all have our thoughts about diet culture. But as an employer, it was pretty great because they had very flexible hours since they're open 7 days a week and sometimes till 9 o'clock at night. And that really came in handy when I finally did get into the VA.
Yes. Yes.
So while I did my internship, thank God, like we had that stipend. But even with that, and even with the student loans, I still had to work every single day of the week. So going months sometimes without having a day off, it's a lot on a person. And towards the end of my internship, I was just having such severe burnout that I started developing severe panic attacks.
Mm.
And it was something that, at the time, we're talking now, 7, 8 years ago, mental health wasn't as talked about as it is now.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to deal with, the effects of going through this while still working, while doing the internship, it was very hard, and it was affecting my performance at my internship towards the end.
Mm.
And I eventually had to open up to my director and kind of let her know what was going on. And she was very understanding. She helped me make a transition in my staff relief to a different rotation.
Mm-hmm.
So just taking some of that pressure off and talking to another dietitian of color that understood what I was going through there at the VA. That really helped me, just that final push to become a dietitian, like to just get past that final threshold. But a lot of those things, the more I talk to a lot of dietitians, it's just not something that they can relate to, and it's something I want internships to be aware of, that I want professors to be aware of when they're, and I had a professor come up to me after when I spoke at Fancy, because I did share a little bit about my journey. And he said, thank you so much for sharing, because I have students that are struggling right now, trying to balance everything, trying to overcome all these, financial barriers and language barriers and everything. So thank you so much for, showing them that it can be done, that it's so difficult, but it can be done. And I try to go out of my way now as a dietitian to try to be the best preceptor I absolutely can be. I've been in their shoes.
Yeah.
I don't know what they're going through, but I can imagine because of what I went through. It really got me to be involved now in Lahidan because I want there to be people like me helping the next generation, helping Latinos and Latinas that want to be dietitians, trying to give them any information that I can. If they reach out to me on Instagram and say, hey, I'm interested in doing dietetics, I'm like, call me. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what you're going to have to prepare for financially, different internships, different routes you can take. It's very difficult. And a lot of us don't have, unfortunately, like the parental guidance because we're first gen, we're the first
Right,
ones to go to
right, right,
college.
right. Hmm.
So,
You're navigating the intricacies of the process, not
right,
only the dietetics specific process, but federal aid and the financial piece and how does this all work and developing financial literacy and all of that at the same time, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
And there's this layer as well when you're in your internship I think for everyone, but I think it's unique, right, person to person, where you're also trying to figure out who your identity is as a professional. Yeah, where you're hearing things in school or experiencing, whether from your preceptors or from patients or whoever it might be, you're experiencing the impact of other people's preferences or, the way that they're saying things should be done. And so
Mhm.
as you are going through that piece of your journey, areas of the internship, curriculum or requirements, did you feel really kind of synced up with your beliefs and values? And, were there already places where you were thinking, like I'm seeing where there's some stereotypes here or some ways of practice that really I don't actually think are probably ideal, based off your experience with WIC and the populations you had worked with.
Mhm. If anything, in my internship, I felt like I found out more about the things I didn't like than
Mm-hmm.
what I did like. Because, CCU, ICU, all of that, it is very hectic. And obviously, you're making a big impact when you're doing, TPN and all of tube feeding, all of that. But for a lot of patients that I saw, it just went by so fast that I felt like I wasn't making an impact in the way that I wanted, right?
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I just had time to go to the rooms, give them a handout, and hope that they followed up. And that to me
Mm-hmm.
just didn't connect with helping someone. And then on the other side, when I was doing outpatient, it wasn't as complex as I was looking for. So the
Ah.
outpatient that I had was a lot of weight loss, a lot of like pre-diabetes, things like that. And after
Mm-hmm.
you repeat that over and over and over and over, even within just my internship, I was already getting bored. I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Like, I'm not really connecting to these tasks, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when I graduated, what ended up happening was my first job was as a dietitian for the Department of Public Safety in North
Mm-hmm.
Carolina. And so that is the prison system, right?
Ah,
So, yes. And
interesting.
yes, I actually learned so much because the way it works over there is that if an offender gets sick, has cancer, needs to be on dialysis, they don't get sent out to the hospital.
Mm.
The state of North Carolina has the state prison with its own hospital. And
Wow.
that's where all the doctors, everything is mental health, everything is there.
Mm.
So it's this huge building, and then each floor is, a different level of acuity. We have our own we had our own dialysis unit. No longer there, so I can't say we,
Right.
but at the
Right.
time.
Sure.
Um, there's a dialysis unit there. There's, everything there. So I became a
Mm-hmm.
dietitian for that system. And there's only two dietitians for the entire building. So we are doing everything. I saw everything you can think of,
Mm.
every comorbidity, a lot of, gunshot wounds and fights and wound healing, like a lot of mental health issues. So I
Right.
think that's where I got the most and quickest exposure to like
Mm-hmm.
different ways to use or different ways that dietitians are involved in
Mm.
nutrition care.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed it. And one of the things that I got exposed to there was dialysis, right?
Mm.
And I
Mm.
really liked that dialysis was so lab heavy and so intricate. Like it's just a big puzzle as far as how all the nutrients work together, how the medications affect the nutrients. And yeah, it's not as fast paced as ICU or CCU. Like you still
Mm-hmm.
see the
Mm-hmm.
same patients all the time. You get to build that rapport and
Yeah.
build those counseling skills. But it's not, it's never boring.
Mm-hmm. So even there, when you were, in that position, you felt like you were developing relationships with your patients, or you were able to make contact with them more than once, and that was part of what you really
Yeah.
liked.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. You could follow up
Yeah.
and see the fruits of your labor.
Mm-hmm. And create interventions based off of the laboratory values. It sounds like that's something else you enjoyed. It's like, okay, here's this value, I do this, and then I
Hmm.
see a change, which is really rewarding.
Yes.
Yeah, to see that kind of quantitative outcome there. Okay, so
Hmm.
you were introduced to dialysis at that point. So talk to us about a little bit, just to backtrack, a little bit about your own kind of food culture upbringing. Bring us back there if you could.
Sure. My parents are from Mexico. I was born and raised here, so I'm Mexican American. But as I mentioned, I grew up on the border. So 95 probably percent of the population in the valley is Hispanic. So I mostly grew up eating Mexican food, you know. And when it came to counseling the WIC population, or even now with my Hispanic dialysis population, it's a blessing to be able to understand the types of foods that they're working with and be able to accommodate the nutrition recommendations to include those foods.
Mhm.
Because one thing that I find, especially now in the dialysis world, is that everyone just keeps getting these lists. Like, it's very black and white of like,
Right.
okay, these are the foods you can't have, and these are the foods you can't have. And whether that's, diabetes or dialysis, or we have just these lists, right? And they don't, that's lazy education to me,
Mm.
because it's so nuanced. You can't just tell a diabetic, and you hear that a lot from your patients. Oh, I have diabetes. I was told I couldn't have white rice. I have diabetes. I was told I couldn't eat tortillas. I was told that I couldn't have corn and I couldn't have this. And so they're excluding and excluding and excluding all these cultural foods. And that goes double in dialysis, because now we're taking into account phosphorus and potassium.
Mhm.
And they're getting these lists saying, oh, beans are high in phosphorus, you can't have them. Nuts are high in phosphorus, you can have them. Tomatoes, avocados, mangoes, those are high in potassium, you can't have them. So
Mhm.
if they're going off of that black and white thinking, it's impossible, right? It's impossible
Mhm.
to embrace your cultural foods
Mm.
and follow this restrictive diet.
Mhm. And
So,
so I want to talk about how you've adapted your counseling and things, but what do you think has been the impact on your patients of some of those lists? Like when you start to work with someone who has a background eating some of those foods and they have just heard, no, 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 no. How are they approaching food at that point in time? Or what has been the mental health impact for them?
no, exactly. So what I find happens to a lot of my patients is that they just feel there's a loss of morale, right?
Yeah.
And they feel like, I should just give up. What's the point? Like, what's the point? If
Mm,
this means that I can't have my favorite foods, then why do it?
yeah.
And that's where you get into this mentality, or at least this is what I hear a lot from, patients that are coming to me thinking that they had to follow this type of diet, is that,
Mm.
you know what, I'm gonna die of something eventually, might as well die of this. Like, they just give up.
Yeah, geez, yeah.
Um, or on the other side of that, if I do have patients that want to follow what they've heard up until this point, then they're sad because they've gone so long without their favorite food. I had one patient tell me before he came to my clinic that he had been told no, he couldn't have beans, so he hadn't had beans in 15 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'm like,
Wow.
oh my goodness, like that's something, at least as the Mexican American, like we eat almost every day. I can't
Right.
imagine not having your cultural foods for years.
What are some of the other challenges that you see with just Latino patients in general with various stages of chronic kidney disease just across the board when it comes to nutritional management?
Yeah, so one big barrier is, of course, the language. There's very few, as it is, there's very few Latina dietitians to begin with, right? Only
Mm,
6% of dietitians are Latino or Latina.
mhm.
And then even less dialysis dietitians or
Yeah.
renal dietitians in general. And think of how many patients on dialysis or with CKD are Hispanic and Spanish speaking.
Yeah.
And just that language barrier alone really keeps them from being able to understand the regimen and like what's being asked of them. So I've had patients where I arrive, right? I started at a new clinic and I meet patients that speak Spanish and they just like light up and they just seem so relieved, like, oh my gosh, I can finally ask questions.
Oh,
Like I
yeah.
can finally, like what does it mean? Like the nutrition, like, well, what does this mean? Or okay, so how can I help my calcium? Like they have all these questions that they haven't been able to get answered up until this point.
Wow.
So yeah, that language barrier is a big deal. And even being able to get into motivational interviewing, because it's one thing, when you have a patient that doesn't share your language, your resources are limited. Sometimes you get to use a translation line, sometimes that's not feasible, especially because a translator doesn't understand the science that you're trying to convey, right? They can't
Sure.
really explain starches and carbohydrates. Like that's just probably not in their, that medical definition is probably not in their usual vocabulary.
Right, sure. They may not understand the intricacies maybe of how to communicate the nutrition info. Yeah.
So we use what we have when we don't share that language, we use handouts, right? But that doesn't give you the ability to go into what's really going on. And that motivational interviewing is so important in any type of dietetics education, any type of nutrition education, but especially in dialysis because they're dealing with so much. They're trying to balance so much. It's a lot of them start to, get burnt out. They start to give up. And so you need to find ways to keep them engaged. And you need to be able to speak the same language to be able to really do that well.
You can just probably hear concerns in a much different way or understand, kind of gets to the heart of the matter more directly and more quickly, right? When you speak the same language. The translator lines are a beautiful thing, but I can imagine it's just so different. So different when you're sharing a language. So language barrier, huge, and that can impact their comprehension, their ability to ask questions. What other unique challenges have you seen in, Hispanic or Latino population around nutritional management of CKD? Anything else that comes to mind?
One that's important to talk about is, again, that financial barrier for these patients, because sometimes if they're not residents, they can't get insurance, right? They're paying everything out of pocket. Or maybe just their insurance they can't afford a very good one, and their insurance doesn't cover these very expensive medications. And when you're on dialysis, usually you're on a lot of different medications. You're on medications trying to control your blood pressure, trying to control your potassium, trying to control your phosphorus, trying to control your diabetes. A lot of patients on
Sure.
Dialysis have diabetes, and to be able to afford all of that on such a limited income, which happens a lot in my Hispanic population, that's a big barrier. And being able to help them get those resources, I usually partner up with the social worker. But I made a point, at least especially in the aspects of like phosphorus and potassium where I'm involved heavily, to learn as much as I can about the resources out there to help them get these binders. So whether that's patient assistance programs or making sure the prior authorizations are getting done, or trying to explain to them what a medical exemption is, like it's very difficult to navigate all of these programs, especially if they're Spanish speakers and they don't even, they can't even really read the forms that explain the program to you. So
Sure. Yeah.
helping them get through those hardships, that's another big challenge.
So when you're meeting with a patient for the first time, and you know that they have a food background that you're trying to honor and respect and incorporate into the counseling relationship, how do you conceptualize the translation of those food or food and cultural practices into clinical care? And can you walk us through what a process looks like with one of those patients?
Whether they're a new patient or not, I always check for their understanding first, right? Before I do any education. I check to see like, okay, what are your ideas? Especially everything's very lab heavy, right? So if I'm seeing they have this really high phosphorus I'll check for, okay, tell me a little bit about phosphorus. What do you understand about it before, we dive into it? And just to see, some of them have been on dialysis for 10 years and they can tell you all about phosphorus, right? And how it affects the body and the different reasons that we want to keep it at a safe level. So checking for understanding. After that, making sure that they know about the different types of phosphorus and how they're absorbed, what foods that we're going to include more often, right? The ones that are lower in phosphorus, we're going to do more often, and how to pair that with when they want a higher phosphorus food, or how to portion a higher phosphorus food. How to change the cooking methods to be able to incorporate a higher phosphorus food. For example, a lot of people worry about beans, and that's why it was like the main food that we focused on for our presentation. So a lot of people worry, beans are so high in phosphorus, or so high in potassium. Okay, but if you leach them, you can get some of that potassium out, right? If you have half a cup, or if you monitor the portion, it's actually a lower phosphorus portion. It's not that black or white thinking, and that's what takes a lot of education to explain, because especially patients who aren't familiar with this concept, at first they might get overwhelmed, because
Sure.
it's so much easier. They sometimes patients want, just tell me what I can have and what I can't have. And I try to explain to them, it's not about this food is safe, this food is not. It's about the portions and how they all combine together. Just like in most other disease states, right? Just like in diabetes, it's not like bread is bad. It's not rice is bad. It's what are you pairing with? How much are you having to keep those blood sugars safe? Same thing for phosphorus, same thing for potassium.
So you're helping them to understand the nuances and how to pair things together and all of that. So what are some of the foods that you find yourself talking about most often? It sounds like beans, that's one group, or legumes. What other foods are you successfully incorporating into your patients' diets where you feel like there's a really nice outcome from that?
Yeah, other common ones I would probably say would be potatoes, right? Another food that gets a bad reputation of being high potassium, that they can't have it. So teaching them about how to incorporate and leach potatoes. Tomatoes is another big one that gets a really bad reputation. I try to explain to them, okay, it's not the same thing having one slice of tomato on your burger versus having a cup of salsa with chips, right? It's going to be a different amount of concentration, different amount of potassium. So you tell me what meal you're trying to make, and I can tell you how to incorporate that tomato into it, right? You want to talk about creating a salad? We can do that. You want to talk about having some pico de gallo on your tacos? We can do that. Or you do want to add a little bit of salsa to your foods? We can talk about that. It's just going to be a difference in portion, and sometimes we're going to have to decide what's more important, right? If it's starting to become a higher potassium meal because it includes avocados and tomatoes and potatoes and just a lot, we might have to reduce the portion of all of them, or you might have to pick 2 out of 3 so that we can keep it in a safe level. But I don't want you to ever feel like you can't have it. Let's just work on it, together.
Oh, I really love that. Yeah, I really love that. Give me an example of a recipe. You're doing like the recipe makeover with them. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So that was something, in fact, this past week, I had my intern create a board to explain to the patients about, like, okay, these are your higher phosphorus foods, these are your lower phosphorus foods. This is how we can pair them together. These are some examples of how we can pair them so that we can create a balanced meal that's not too high in phosphorus. So things like that are good resources for them.
Yeah.
I think another one that I really like to talk about is avocado, because avocado is pretty high in potassium. So there's a video that I use with the permission of my friend, Maria Eugenia. She's also a renal dietitian, and she created a video on, I think it's Instagram, where she shows the different portions of avocado and how, like, this much potassium is in this portion versus this portion versus this portion. And I help them see, the visual of, like, the different portions and how much potassium they have. And think those resources are really needed. So I'm super happy that, she also works on creating those. And sometimes you don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
talking about those foods with them, that really helps with their stress around being able to eat these foods and enjoy them and still, embrace their cultural foods, but be able to have safe levels of phosphorus and potassium.
Yeah. Are there other visual tools that you like, whether plates or, so you mentioned a video just now, anything else you use in your day-to-day counseling sessions that comes to mind?
Well, in my day-to-day, in a dialysis center, you're usually rounding on the floor, right?
Yeah,
It's
right.
all the chairs are right next to each other, and you go talk
Yeah.
to them. Things that I've brought before is examples of products, and I show them how to find those phosphorus additives and those potassium additives in the food label. Just to give a little background in case this is a student that's like, what are you talking about? That's listening to this podcast. So for phosphorus and for potassium, they are absorbed at different rates depending on where it's coming from, right? So if it's coming from a plant-based source, that phosphorus, that potassium isn't very well absorbed versus if it's coming from an animal, it's absorbed a little bit more as far as the phosphorus. And then if it's coming from chemicals that are added to foods to help with the freshness or emulsification or 1,000 different reasons a food company can use a potassium or phosphorus additive, those additives are absorbed 90 to 100%. Even if they're on binders, it can't really stop just how well absorbed it is. So in order to be able to find those potassium and phosphorus additives, you're not really going to see it on the nutrition label, not the top part. You're going to only find it in the ingredients. So I walk around with like products that do or don't have these additives. And I ask them, okay, can you find the additive? So then what do you think? Like, is this a low phosphorus food or a high phosphorus?
Are there any specific products that have caught you off guard or that have surprised you that have some of those additives in them that are really commonly consumed in the population you work with?
It's hard because it's everywhere. And it's
Yeah.
brand to brand. Like
Brand to brand,
it's
yeah.
not even the product itself, it's the brand. It's the food manufacturer,
How
right?
they produce it. Yeah.
So to give you an example, for Mexican hot chocolate, and I talk about this in my presentation, in Mexican hot chocolate, there's two very popular brands, which is the Abuelita brand and then the Chocolate Barra brand. But if you put the ingredients next to each other, the Abuelita brand has phosphorus and potassium additives, but the Chocolate Barra does not. So
Wow.
both of these are Mexican hot chocolate. You can, obviously you still want to be careful with your portion, but one of them is going to have more phosphorus and potassium than the other one.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really good example. The power of label reading. Yes. Knowledge for sure. Okay. So, in terms of benefits of incorporation, when those that you're working with realize that they can incorporate some of their favorite foods, what do you think the benefits are for those individuals? How does it change their relationship with food or nutrition or their health?
A lot of relief because it is a lot to have to deny your own culture and deny your own identity. And the patient is thinking, I'm doing this for my health, but it affects them. So to be able to be reunited with these
Mm.
foods,
Hmm.
it's very important to them and sometimes makes it feel more doable for them. So they don't have to think it's something they have to live without. And they're like, okay, I can do this. If I just have to learn about the absorption or learn about portions, that's more doable than like never having it again and
Yeah.
just
Oh, yeah.
tossing it all out the window.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So I can imagine that it probably changes the dynamics even within families too, with family
Yes.
meals and being with community and being able to participate.
We don't want them to have to make separate meals, especially during special occasions.
Mm.
We don't want them to feel like they're other or not part of the celebration. So we do talk to them, especially in the holiday season. Okay, tell me about the kind of foods that you usually have during this meal, like your
Mhm.
Christmas dinner, whatever that may be. Tell me about what foods and sides and garnishes you typically use. Let's see if we can find a way to include that one thing you really love that might be higher phosphorus, higher potassium, and pair it with those lower phosphorus, lower potassium foods. But you can still take part in the celebration and you can still eat the same foods. It might just be different portions,
Mhm.
but you can still be a part of it. And
Yeah.
that's very important to them.
I love that. Okay, so other perspective, words of wisdom.
Yeah, in my podcast, I talk about how important it is as dietitians, not just to always be learning the science behind everything, do a great job of that, right? Getting CEUs and going to conferences and always learning about the newest research, but also always be learning about other cultural foods because it makes such a big difference to be able to at least know what they're talking about. So whenever possible, try out different cuisines. If you know dietitians of different backgrounds, talk to them about food because they'll be able to, one, understand the cultural aspect, and they'll also be able to explain it to you in a way that you would understand. Like you guys can talk about, okay, hey, so I work a lot with the diabetes population. If I really wanted to help my Black population or my Vietnamese population, how would you treat someone of that culture? Like if I'm talking to my Vietnamese dietitian friend, like, okay, I have a patient with diabetes. What recommendations do you have? Like, what foods should I be aware of? What celebrations should I be aware of? And me having these questions is what led me to creating my podcast. I thought to myself, okay, a dietitian will be able to explain it from both sides, from the nutrition side and from the cultural side. So I think it's the responsibility of us as dietitians to always be learning about these cultural foods and what their role is in nutrition so that we never have to tell someone, no, you can't have this, or no, you shouldn't have this. Or, I mean, there are times it's going to happen that I don't know what that is. I'm going to have to Google that. But
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But the more familiar you are, the better a dietitian you're going to be.
So it sounds like finding a new restaurant is one strategy to try. And then, just networking and staying connected. And certainly your podcast is a great resource for that because you're having conversations with other dietitians and kind of diving into, all right, what are the intricacies of these different cultural practices, et cetera. So I encourage people to head over there and take a listen. Any other points of interest to you? Anything else you'd like to bring up before we begin to close?
No, don't be afraid to refer out. If you know, like you mentioned, always network and get to know dietitians of different background. And if you know that your patient would really benefit of having a dietitian that share that background that might be able to better help them, don't be afraid to refer out.
You want people to feel like they have the best rapport possible so they can be served to the highest extent. All right, so let's close it out. Do you have a quote or a poem, something that you'd like to close us with?
So hopefully I remember this correctly. It's a song that's in Spanish and it has a part that says, yo te llevo adentro hasta la raíz y por más que crezca vas a estar aquí. And what that means is I carry you with me down to my roots. And no matter how much I grow, you will always be there. And I feel like our cultural identity, our cultural foods, like that's just something that we carry us down to our core. And no matter how much we might, grow and evolve as people, that's always going to be a part of us. And so it's very important to embrace and celebrate that.
A big thank you to Integrative Ideas and Dietetics podcast for having me. Please go follow them. And if you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more about cultural inclusion and nutrition and dietetics, follow our podcast, Food Culture Curious. You can find us anywhere you enjoy your socials. We are on Instagram, TikTok as Food Culture Curious. There's also our Facebook group, Food Culture Curious Dietitians. You can reach out to me and I'll give you the private link to that. And as always, if you want to support our podcast, you can always visit Buy Me a Coffee /Food Culture Curious. Thank you guys. And now for a quick disclaimer. Food Culture Curious is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not take the place of medical advice from licensed healthcare professionals. If you need to seek medical advice, please speak to your healthcare provider. Thank you for listening.